Muy buenas tardes a todos. Empezamos en un minuto. Muy buenas tardes a todas y todos. Mi nombre es Fabiola Velarde y soy parte del equipo de FERLAC Jalisco, trabajando desde el componente de emprendimiento. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos en esta charla sobre inteligencia artificial. Les comparto que al finalizar la sesión tendremos unos minutos para preguntas y respuestas. Les pedimos de favor que las escriban en inglés en la parte de Q&A y en la sección de comentarios de la transmisión en vivo de Facebook. Antes de iniciar, queremos mostrarles un video sobre la iniciativa de FERLAC Jalisco. Me parece que no se escucha.
FERLAC Jalisco trabaja a través de la articulación de academia, sociedad civil, sector público y sector privado en 3 componentes. Uno es la implementación de soluciones tecnológicas mediante técnicas de inteligencia artificial para resolver problemáticas sociales en Jalisco. Otro es la recomendación y creación de política pública para el uso de inteligencia artificial, así como el impulso del uso ético y responsable de esta. Y el tercer componente es el fortalecimiento del ecosistema emprendedor local de inteligencia artificial responsable. FERLAC Jalisco forma parte de uno de los hubs de FERLAC que tienen presencia en Medellín, Colombia, Costa Rica y Uruguay. En Jalisco se cuenta con un diferenciador único, el componente de emprendimiento que busca fortalecer al ecosistema emprendedor en IA a través de actividades como el programa de aceleración de startups de IA FACIA, IA Talks, talleres de integración de inteligencia artificial responsable y de Venture Capital, hackatones y el análisis del ecosistema jalisciense de emprendimiento en inteligencia artificial. FERLAC, por un uso ético y responsable de la inteligencia artificial.
Gracias. Y ahora sí, para arrancar con nuestra charla, haremos un switch a inglés para darle la bienvenida a nuestros speakers. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today we will talk about ethics and artificial intelligence. And I want to present our amazing speakers, Kathy and Joab from Salesforce. Kathy is a principal architect of ethical AI practice at Salesforce. Kathy develops research-informed best practices to educate Salesforce employees, customers, and the industry on the development of responsible AI. She collaborates and partners with external AI and ethics experts of continuously evolve Salesforce policies, practices, and products. Prior to Salesforce, she worked at Google, eBay, and Oracle in user experience research. She received her MS in engineering psychology and BS in applied psychology from the Georgia Institute of Technology. Joab helps institute, embed, and scale industry-leading best practice for the responsible development, use, and deployment of AI. Prior to joining the ethical AI team, Joab worked at Omnitar Network, where he created and led the Responsible Computer Science Challenge and helped develop ethical IOS, a risk mitigation toolkit for technologists. And before that, he brought to bear his Stanford undergraduate studies in religious studies and political science as a leader and two-time founder of mission-driven social impact organizations. Thanks in advance. Kathy and Joab, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Fabi. And thank you everyone for being here. Good afternoon, good evening. Appreciate you joining us. Let me share my screen so we have something to look at together. Okay, so before I begin, I just need to do one quick bit of business, which is to flash all of these English words at you. And apologies for starting this way, but Salesforce is a publicly traded company here in the United States. And so we advise that if you are a Salesforce customer or consider becoming a Salesforce customer at any point, you should make those buying decisions based only on the products that are commercially available today, and not any forward-looking statements that we may make. Kathy and I have already been introduced, so I won't spend any time here, and we'll just get into the meat of our conversation tonight, which is really about the ethics of artificial intelligence and where we find ourselves at this point in time in the development of artificial intelligence, particularly in Latin America, and the ways we at Salesforce conceptualize and think about bringing to bear responsible practices for the development and deployment of that artificial intelligence. So just to set the frame, the context for what we're going to be discussing tonight. These are all headlines from the United States. I recognize that these are not from Latin America. I couldn't quite find the magazine covers that I wanted from Mexico. But here you see that we find ourselves at a moment of inflection where there's a real question about the trust that we have in intelligence that is not human and in technology more broadly. And those questions are accelerating tremendously as the technology accelerates tremendously. You know, these are the sets of headlines that you can find in the United States, in daily papers, in magazines, et cetera, all questioning whether we should be scared of artificial intelligence, whether human beings will be replaced by robots, how much the AI apocalypse might be upon us, right? Real questions that we are wrestling with about business and society and the role that each plays. And in fact, when a survey was conducted here in the United States, 41% of the executives who were surveyed said that they had abandoned an AI system when an ethical issue had arisen, because they weren't quite sure how to address that. And that means wasted time, financial investment, bad legal and PR risks, and headlines like these. So it's really crucial to be thinking about the ethics of AI from the outset. To give this a little bit of context then for Latin America and Mexico specifically, you know, in the next 15 years or so, nearly 10 million of all the jobs in Mexico can potentially be exposed to automation, meaning that whether that is customer service or route planning for buses, whether that is sales and commerce, or whether that is hiring, lots of jobs are going to touch artificial intelligence. And so therefore, it's also really worth thinking through the impact that that artificial intelligence will have on the society and the people that it touches. And this is accelerating tremendously. You know, in Latin America, we've got Banco Galicia, Avianca, Shopfácil, which have all adopted chatbots for customer service, or the Not company in Chile, which has developed an algorithm to analyze food products to generate recipes, or Peru's National University, which has built machines to detect natural gases. One of the universities here in the US, MIT, did a global survey of senior business executives worldwide and found that by the end of 2019, nearly 80% of companies in Latin America launched AI programs. And those were, by and large, delivering very positive returns. In fact, fewer than 2% had made lower than expected returns. So really by 2022, AI will be ubiquitous across Latin America. And yet, at the same time, getting back to my earlier point about sort of how do we as human beings think about the role that artificial intelligence plays in our lives, 49% of Latin American people think that the development of those machines, that artificial intelligence or robot, will mostly cause harm. People are suspicious about the positive impacts. And you can see on this map, in fact, that Latin America is by and large the most suspicious about the potential positive impacts and really cautiously looking at the kinds of harm that AI can cause, as compared to, say, East Asia, where the view is mostly positive, if you look at this map at China, Japan, etc. So giving it that Latin American specific context is also important for our conversation tonight, because Latin America is too often being left on the sidelines, even though those 10 million jobs could potentially be exposed to automation. There are nearly 1,200 identified codes and principles pertaining to ethics out in society, but 63% of those are from the West, from the more developed countries, the United States, Europe, et cetera. And so while this is having tremendous impact and adoption in Latin America, we're not yet seeing the kind of principled, responsible development of AI yet to bring it to the region as a whole. At the same time, I want to just point out that at least in Mexico specifically, Mexico has led Latin America. With all of that context behind us, that it was one of the first of the countries in Latin America to launch an artificial intelligence strategy. And the #1 theme in that strategy proposal was to consider ethics. And so I hope we're not here for nothing. We have something to say about the ethics of artificial intelligence to bring to that discussion. Because this is happening. This is a project that you may or may not be familiar with. This was a Facebook project with the Inter-American Development Bank, which gathered 19 researchers and experts from Latin America and the Caribbean to create academic papers. And the synergy between industry and academic universities and centers has been really critical to pushing forward this conversation about ethical artificial intelligence. You can see here, I'm highlighting ITESM tonight, but the development in the university context of these principles, as well as these centers, research, et cetera, is also pushing forward the horizon on the responsible development of technology. Now, what do we care at Salesforce about any of that? First, I want to give you just a quick view of what is Salesforce, because you may actually be sitting there and thinking, okay, Yoav, you've told me all about how artificial intelligence is growing in Latin America, but what does that have to do with you sitting in California and the company that you work for, Salesforce? Well, Salesforce is a huge platform that connects most of the largest companies in the world to the people who use those companies. So we power commerce sites, customer service, sales, marketing, a huge range of business functions. And here I'll highlight, if you see on the left side of your screen here, 80 billion Einstein predictions. Einstein is the name of our artificial intelligence products. And that means that we are reaching at scale nearly, making 80 billion assessments, analyses, predictions every day, which is a vast scale in terms of the reach that we have across many, many people in many parts of the world. Of course, all of that brings a set of challenges along with it. So, we are a heterogeneous set of products, very different, which makes our challenge as ethicists very complicated, because there's no consistency in the kinds of products we develop necessarily. A marketing product is very different than a call center for service. We also try to avoid guidance because we are a customizable platform. We want to enable our customers to configure their Salesforce systems to serve their needs the most. And so we are limited in what we can advise and what we choose to do. Lastly, there is this idea of subjectivity, right? There is no standard definition of ethics. It's hard to measure, although Kathy will talk in a little bit about some ways to measure it. But unlike, say, security, where you can easily identify where there might be a gap in your security or where a hacker could access your system, it's a little bit harder to identify exactly what we mean when we say ethics. So for tonight's conversation, for all intents and purposes, we want to call ethics sort of risk. places where harm can be caused. And we care about those things because at Salesforce, we have values that drive the work we do. We have 4 core values, which have existed since 1999 when we were founded. And those are trust, customer success, innovation, and equality. And we truly believe that those drive the work that we do. And so all of our work in ethics really stems from that fundamental principle of trust and equality, making sure that everyone is included and everyone has a seat at the table to be heard. So we Kathy really began our ethical AI practice at Salesforce a few years ago to bring those practices and those values to life in the way we develop and deploy technology. So we really have 3 areas that we focus on. The first is our internal culture and product design. How do we actually design AI products that have ethics built in from the beginning? The second is how do our customers deploy them and the impact that they then have in the world? And the last is advancing the field of artificial intelligence, generally the work that we're doing here tonight in talking about these issues. So why does a company need a practice like Kathy's and mine? Really, it provides focus and direction to help guide decision-making. It sets clear boundaries and communicates that trust and ethics matter. And we've also seen that customers really care about this. It communicates that trust externally in addition to communicating it internally. And we've also seen that it can be an important differentiator for companies who want to sell their product and have people adopt it because of the way it was built. So the kinds of things we worry about, given that ethical practice, are the kinds of technologies and applications that you see on your screen now. Technologies and AI that could make decisions about people's access to health or justice in terms of the kinds of prison sentences they might receive. Things that could discriminate against people or deny them opportunity to education or to work. Things that could harm children or the poor. Things that spread mis and disinformation, that use personal information about people. And as we conceive of all of those potential harms and worries, we want to really understand the unintended potential consequences of each of those things in those target areas. Because AI applications have the potential to violate human rights, to be used for surveillance, like facial recognition technology, to mislead people, to make really ill-advised criminal justice decisions, or to do things that are scientifically suspicious, like trying to gauge how I'm feeling from how my face looks, which we know is contextual and societal and personal. And so those kinds of applications that AI might be tested to be used are not necessarily bringing to life the kinds of principles that we want to imbue into our artificial intelligence. And so I'll quickly wrap up here before I hand it over to Kathy with a look at what our principles are for the development of responsible technology. As I mentioned, there are nearly 1,200 of these out in the world right now. This is ours at Salesforce. And we really believe that AI should be 5 things. First, it should be responsible. And that means safeguarding human rights, ensuring that those direct harms to people that I mentioned don't occur, and that we protect the data that we're entrusted with. We believe it should be accountable, meaning that we collect feedback for continuous improvement and make sure that we are responsible to the people that we are impacting. We believe that AI should be, third, transparent, meaning that we help people understand the way that decisions are made and the predictions and analyses and assessments that it's making are clear and explainable. We think that AI should be empowering, meaning that it should promote growth and societal benefit. And lastly, that it should be inclusive, meaning that everyone is included, that it respects everyone who's impacted, not just those of the creators, we sitting in technology companies who are building the AI, but all the people around the world who are impacted by it. And so what does that mean in terms of bringing it to life? It means we work with human rights experts. We share our research openly. We invite customer feedback. We develop mechanisms for engagement with experts. We allow our customers to control their data. We build apps that are empowering and train people to use them in ways that they can best meet their needs. We test all of our models with diverse data that represent a spectrum of people, not just one kind of person. And we build inclusive teams of the technologists who are generating and engineering and building the AI in the first place. So it's all a very quick overview of some of the things that we attempt to bring in terms of that viewpoint on ethics in AI. And at this point, I'll hand it over to Kathy, who's going to look a little bit more in depth at some of the issues around those, the inclusion and diversity and responsibility of our AI in terms of bias and fairness. Kathy?
Thank you, Yoav. Hopefully people are thinking of lots of great questions, and you can add those into the chat at any point in time. We really would like for this to be a discussion with folks. So I thought the next thing that we could talk about is what do we mean by these different terms? There were a number of different terms that Yoav mentioned as he was speaking, from bias to fairness, equality, equity, accuracy. So what do each of these mean? First of all, when we talk about bias, we think about it in terms of statistics. We mean it in terms of error, that no prediction can ever be 100% accurate 100% of the time. It means that there's some level of error in your decision making, and it may be benign. It may be when a shopping site is just automatically recommending makeup or dresses to women, and there may be people that are not on the gender spectrum. There may be men that enjoy makeup or dresses, and by not serving them ads, you are making an error. There is a bias against them. Is there harm that is caused in that particular case by not showing them those particular ads? Not so much, but other kinds of bias, like the types of jobs you might show, or whether or not you approve someone for a loan based on their race or their gender. That's a very harmful type of bias that we really want to move towards mitigating and preventing from happening. So there are a number of ways that an AI system can become biased. The first is through the business processes that we have in place today, all of the human decision making, where we are deciding before the AI is even applied, things like who gets access to certain services or benefits. In the US, we have food and housing benefits for people who may have lost their jobs or who are lower income. And so any of the business processes or decision making that humans do can have bias in it. And when you apply AI using the information that comes from those processes, you are not only replicating that same bias, you can actually amplify it. The next way that it can come in is through foundational assumptions that the AI creators make. So when they are deciding what is the purpose of this AI system, who is going to be impacted by it, what are the values or the context of use for those individuals that the AI is going to touch, all of the lived experiences of the creators, if they are different from the individuals that are being impacted, we're going to see a gap there. We're going to see bias or error coming in. Training data is another big place that we see. So when you have to find data in order to train an AI model. And so is that data representative of everyone in society that's going to be impacted by it? Is there any historical or systematic bias in who is represented and how? How accurate is the data about everyone? And then finally, in the model, the AI model itself, is it using any sensitive variables? Sensitive variables are things that may be protected by law. So in the US, for example, you're not allowed to make a decision as to whether or not someone can receive a loan based on their age, race, or gender. Those protected categories are called sensitive variables. There's also something called proxy variables that can be at work. In the US, we have a history of racism in deciding where people can live. It's called redlining, where there were certain neighborhoods where different people would be approved to buy houses or have a loan to buy a house or live in. As a result of that, our mailing codes, our zip codes, are correlated with race. So if you know somebody's zip code, there could be a strong probability that you can guess what their race is. So if you don't want to include race in your AI model, you shouldn't include zip code as well, because zip code can be a proxy for race. So I'm going to go into a little bit more depth in each of these four to give you some more examples, because when we understand the places that bias can come into an AI system, it shows us the places that we really need to pay attention, that we really need to be vigilant. So as I mentioned earlier, humans can introduce bias through our existing business processes. Who has a bank traditionally approved loans for? Who has a company traditionally hired and promoted? If you use the information from those past decisions to train your AI, it's only going to amplify those same disparities. Data handling is another place. So when someone cleans the data, they decide to remove duplicates, or they decide that this is not a valid data point, and so they delete it. You can add bias in that way. How you label your data can be subjective, and that can also insert bias. When the individual, the user of an AI system, receives recommendations or predictions, they can add bias in whether or not they decide to act on those recommendations. So in the case of a loan AI system, they can decide whether or not to accept the recommendation to approve or decline a loan. Each time you accept or decline, accept or reject a recommendation, you're training that system, and you can be adding in bias. And then finally, through your data or model management, there's often a saying in enterprise software called set and forget. You want to put in the settings, you want to get everything set up, and then you don't want to have to go back in. You don't want to fuss with it and have to constantly maintain it. That's seen as a benefit. But when it comes to AI systems, you can't set and forget. You have to regularly monitor your model. You have to audit the training data and the outcomes, because AI, by definition, learns. It changes over time. And so what may be fair and unbiased today, 6 weeks or 6 months from now, can change. Next, let's think a little bit more about the foundational assumptions that AI creators make. When you are deciding whether or not to build an AI system, you have to really think through all of your stakeholders, everyone that's going to be impacted. What is the context of how this system is going to be used? The environment that it will be used in. What are the values? What's the value system of the individuals that are going to be impacted, and what are their needs? Is there any historical bias at work that we need to be aware of? So the image here is from a study that the investigative journalism organization ProPublica did on Compass. Compass is a parole recommendation system. In the US, when someone is convicted of a crime and they're serving time in jail, they are often given an opportunity to shorten their system. Their sentence. They can get out of jail early if they are well behaved or if certain criteria are met. And so usually a judge is the one that makes those decisions, who gets out of jail early and who doesn't. Compass is a risk detection or risk assessment tool. And it is supposed to predict how likely is an individual to go out and commit a crime again if you let them out of jail early. Over and over and over again, we found, or ProPublica found, that this system would predict that people of color, African Americans, brown people, that they were at higher risk than people with very similar backgrounds, crimes, things like that, than white criminals. And so here is an example. Both of these individuals similarly were arrested for shoplifting, but the Black individual was given a much higher risk score than a white individual. The reason this happened was a fundamental assumption that the creators made. They assumed that if you have served time in jail previously, that you're probably a more hardened criminal. You're probably going to go out and commit crimes again. What they didn't realize is that minorities are less likely to be able to pay court fines or parking or speeding tickets. They're less likely to be able to afford bail than their white counterparts are. The result is that the white individuals can basically buy their way out of serving time in jail. So simply having money means that you are viewed by this system as being lower risk of recommitting a crime. And that's not actually the case. Training data is another area that I mentioned that we can insert bias into an AI system. So here is a very simple example of an image classification system. And we can imagine that in this case, we want to train this AI to be able to detect the difference between photos of dogs and photos of cats. And so we give it a whole bunch of pictures of black dogs and a whole bunch of pictures of brown and white cats. And then we show it a picture of an adorable, fluffy white dog. And the model comes out with very high confidence that this is a cat. This seems ridiculous. This is a very, very simple example. Obviously, if the system has never seen a white dog before, it's only been presented with pictures of white cats, it picks up on color as being the key factor. And so we have to pay attention to what are the data that we are feeding into the system. What are the attributes that are missing? The white dogs and the black cats that are going to skew the recommendations or the predictions that an AI system makes. And then finally, we have model bias itself, the actual system that's making the prediction. This is another image classification model, and it used a well-known data set called ImageNet. And unfortunately, going back to our training data, we saw that there are way more pictures in that data set of women cooking than men. And so in the model itself, it began to pick up on other attributes. And so gender ended up getting skewed. And so the model in this case identifies the picture in the middle here of a man as actually being a woman. And so if we go to the next slide, we can see this larger system of all different kinds of bias. There are many different biases to be aware of that enter the system at different points. So you've got just the data generation, that all of the things that are happening in the world that can be impacted through historical bias. And then the population of individuals that you select, the data that you are pulling out to train your system can be influenced through representation bias. How you're measuring the inputs and the outputs can be biased through measurement bias. You put all of this into your data set and you train it and feed it into the model, and you have evaluation bias and then aggregation bias. All of these things, each step along the way, you are creating bias in your system, increasing the error and decreasing your accuracy. So a few additional terms. We have fairness, equality, equity. Sometimes these words are used interchangeably, but it's actually important to understand what these different terms mean and when you should use one versus the other. So for fairness, we define this as a decision made free from self-interest, prejudice, or favoritism. We are trying to remove anything from our decision making that will sway a decision one way or another. When we talk about equality, we mean that everyone in the system is treated identically. This is something called group fairness. But with equity, we're saying that similar groups of people are treated similarly. This is called individual fairness. Now, this might not make a lot of sense, but if we take a look at this image, hopefully this clears it up a little bit. Our image on the left-hand side shows three of our Salesforce mascots. We have Cody, Astro, and Einstein. And they're all at this lookout point of this gorgeous waterfall. And all three of them have equal access to this waterfall. But Cody is the only one that can actually see and enjoy the waterfall because of the difference in height. They're being treated equally by given the equal access, but it's not fair. They're not given a fair access to the waterfall. On the right-hand side, we have a definition of equity. By adding a few additional rocks here, both Astro and Einstein can now enjoy the view of the waterfall. It doesn't take away from Cody's experience of being able to see the waterfall, but it gives them an extra boost so that they have the same opportunity. When we talk about fairness, there are actually 21 different statistical definitions of fairness. And these are just a few of them. There's a fantastic video if you go onto YouTube and you do a search for 21 definitions of fairness, and the professor goes through and explains each one of these. And depending on what the type of model or what the outcome is that you want to get, influences which of the definitions of fairness you want to use, because not all definitions of fairness are created equally. So at Salesforce, as we go through and do risk assessments of our projects, there are a few different mitigation solutions that we try to put in place to try and avoid harmful bias. And I'm going to share a few of those with you. So the first is our acceptable use policy. Every company, software company, hardware company, they have something like this. It might be called terms of use, terms of service, but it's a set of legally binding guidelines that specify how customers or users of that tool or system are and are not allowed to use it. So ours is called the acceptable use policy. And we have a section that specifically lays out how customers can use our AI products. And so here are a few of them. Our AUP states that you cannot use our AI to communicate to any third party that our chatbots are a human. You can't pretend that this bot is not a bot. You have to make it clear you are talking to technology. You're talking to a chatbot. This is not a human. Trying to trick someone into believing that you're interacting with a human is just yucky, and it's not a very smart thing to do. It's unlikely that a chatbot is going to be so flawless, so brilliant that somebody is going to be unsure, is this a human or a bot? Customers are also prevented from using Einstein to predict very sensitive categories. So again, sensitive categories or sensitive variables are these protected features. These innate values are very sensitive characteristics about individuals that can lead to harmful treatment. So you can't try to guess or predict someone's race, their religion, their sexual orientation, criminal convictions, health status. None of those things are allowed. If it's important for a company to know this information about its customers or users, they should collect that information directly and not try to guess it. You also cannot use our AI to create or analyze biometric identifiers like your face print, your voice print. Another way of saying this is that you can't use our Einstein Vision product for facial recognition. We've never permitted facial recognition with our AI. And then finally, you can't use Einstein as part of a decision-making process with legal or similarly significant effects unless a human makes that final decision. You can have the AI help make a decision, like should someone get a loan, but you can't automate that. At the end of the day, a human must make that final decision to approve or reject. So when Yoav and I meet with teams, there are a number of questions that we are asking. There are a number of things we want our teams to think through. What are the intended and unintended consequences that could result from a particular use of an AI? What are the positive aspects that we want to focus on and amplify? And what are the negative aspects that we want to minimize or mitigate as much as possible? Do we have enough perspective to understand the risk of harm to vulnerable populations? Vulnerable populations can be children, the elderly. And if we don't know enough, then how can we supplement it? How do we mitigate harm, and how do we know if we are successful? We create model cards for all of our models. We have a bit.ly link there. These are like, if you would like to see the ones that we've published, these are like one-pagers or nutrition labels that communicate important aspects of our models. And it helps our customers or purchasing decision makers understand, what does the model do? How did we build it? We also have a number of ethical features to help customers use our AI more responsibly. So in this case, highlighting sensitive fields and their proxy variables so that a customer can decide whether or not to use them in their model. We also have in-app guidance, so providing information to, again, help a customer figure out how can they use this product safely and identify when bias might be at play. I think we can skip through. I think we've got a couple of examples. Oh, here we are. And so there are a number of resources that we have available. If you would like to learn more about our ethical practices, blog posts, and trailheads for training. I think that's all. All right.
So I think we're going to take some questions.
All right. Who do you think should be responsible for developing rules or policies to avoid unethical use of AI or technology overall? Maybe I'll take a stab at it, Yoav, and you can add in.
Sure.
I think that this needs to be a collective ownership. First and foremost, the individuals, the companies, the engineers that are creating the technology need to think very deeply about what is responsible. Is this going to have potential harm on society, and how can we mitigate that? So first and foremost, the creators need to think about that. But we also do need to have civil society and government weighing in about what are the red lines. Self-regulation is not always effective. And so having very clear red lines ensures that everybody is working on an even playing field, so that there aren't some that feel like they are being harmed from a business perspective because they're being more ethical, more safe than their competitors who are willing to make profits by any means necessary.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think this is a more hands equal better work kind of situation, where if this were left to any one of the players that Kathy just mentioned, I think we would miss some very important aspects of this. So it requires everyone to come to the table to think about those unethical uses. So, the primary people being those who are affected the most by the technology, who are unfortunately the least likely to have a voice in that process. So, again, going back to what Kathy discussed about vulnerable populations, minorities, et cetera, right? To have those populations have a voice in how they are impacted by the technologies, as well as the technologists, the companies, the nonprofit and non-governmental organization sector, civil society, and then government, and all of these together probably make for the best ecosystem of responsible technology and responsible AI creation. The next question here was, is there an example you could share with us of a use case in Vladdam or Mexico where you've applied your guiding ethical principles? And I think, unfortunately, the answer to that is no at present. This is actually, I think, Kathy's and my first chance to really engage with a group in Mexico. So thank you for having us. We're looking forward to many more engagements and conversations like this. And certainly, if you are at a company, in a research lab, as a student, in any way thinking about the development of artificial intelligence, we'd be happy to have a conversation with you, to discuss with you, to think about the ways that you can prevent some of the unethical uses that we've been discussing. So our email addresses were on the screen before. We can send them again, and you can feel free to reach out to us at any time.
I would say this isn't in Latin America or Mexico, but perhaps one interesting example is the training of our chatbots. And so Yoav is our internal expert for conversational AI, and he works with a linguist and conversational designer to ensure that our chatbot is going to be able to recognize all of the customers interacting with it, regardless of their accent or dialect. And so one of the things that we talk about are the different vernaculars. There are different ways that you can speak a language. So in the US, we have the standard English vernacular, the one that's taught in school, the one that when a teacher says, you're not following your grammar rules, that's a misspelling, you're not spelling that correctly. they're basing that on the standard English vernacular, but we have other vernaculars as well: the African American English vernacular, the Chicano English vernacular, Creole English vernacular. And so they have, each one of those vernaculars have their own grammars and spellings and things like that. And so we want to ensure that when we're training our systems, that we find enough representative data so that when people have those different vernaculars, accents, dialects, that the system will work equally well. You don't have to be someone that is born in the US, went to school in the US, and are well trained and versed in the standard English vernacular in order for it to work for you.
We have a bunch of questions here. One of them here is, given that there are so many sources of bias, can you ever be sure that your AI model is completely unbiased? And the answer to that is no. It is impossible to remove bias. Yeah. If we think that we can create artificial intelligence that is bias-free, that is a fantasy. Because no matter what, we are, as human beings, bringing some amount of our own biases to the table in making the decisions about what data we include and what we don't, how we think about what objective we want to achieve and how to measure that objective, and whether at the end of the day, everyone is included or not, and what kinds of fairness we want to optimize for. And so there will always be bias in an AI system. The question is not then how to eliminate bias entirely, but just how to mitigate it, how to minimize it, how to bring it down to a level that is as small as it can be based on all of those assumptions that you as a human are making about how to eliminate that bias. And so it's actually a very important point to make that it is not possible to have an artificial intelligence system that has no bias. Anyone who claims that is not thinking deeply enough about their artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
Kathy, here's a question that maybe you want to tackle. What are some general best practices or recommendations that to ensure that the data and workflows and algorithms don't end up with that bias? So some very practical tips that you might be able to offer.
Yeah, so there are a number of processes that we put in place internally. So when at the beginning of a project, we will do something called consequence scanning workshops. And so if you do a search for consequence scanning workshops and .everyone, they're the organization that created it. It's this formalized process to go through and think about what are all of the potential unintended consequences of a system, and then you can start thinking about ways that you can mitigate those harms. Another step that you can do are something called community juries that was created by Microsoft. And that is bringing in representatives from vulnerable communities to really participate throughout the development life cycle with the team to think about how do we ensure that this AI system is taking into account the values of the individuals. There are also a number of tools that are open source, free to use, like IBM's AI 360, Microsoft's Fair Learn, that you can use to evaluate the training data or your models for potential bias and fairness. And I saw that there's another question in there later on about monitoring AI and harm. And that is something that you need to regularly do. You need to bake this in as a process. And so Einstein Discovery, one of our AI tools, has a way that you, if you have highlighted the sensitive variables in your data set or in your model, so again, age, race, gender, it's going to give you a number of different insights about it. So identifying, are there proxy variables related to it? identifying if there's disparate impact. That's a definition of fairness. So for example, is the outcome for predicting whether or not somebody, or recommending whether or not somebody should get a loan, is it different for men than it is for women? And then it will generate notifications for you. So if your model starts drifting, if it starts changing over time, and so whereas there wasn't a disparate impact by gender when you first launched it, but now 6 weeks or 6 months later, there is disparate impact happening, you'll get a notification for it. So when you're deciding about what AI tools to use, those are the kinds of things that you want to look for. You want to find something that's going to help you identify measures of bias and fairness, and that will alert you if your model begins drifting, or if you begin introducing bias over time.
Right, and I think, Kathy, what you're describing is, what we call fairness through awareness at some level, right? It rhymes nicely in English, right? So if you stop looking at the factors that are built into your model, it's very easy to miss that disparate impact that Kathy was describing. So there was a good example here in the United States a few years ago when Apple computers started issuing credit cards. And as part of those recommendations, right, you have to apply for a credit card to be granted one by the issuer. And Apple was approving for credit cards men at a much higher rate than women. Now, when asked, Apple said, why is that happening? Apple said, well, we are not even looking at men versus women. Gender isn't even included in our model, so it can't possibly be biased. It can't possibly be recommending credit cards for men over women, because we haven't even included gender. But as Kathy was describing earlier, there are all sorts of proxies for gender. So for example, unfortunately, based on historical patterns, men tend to, and certainly not in all cases, but tend to have a higher income than women. Men's job titles have typically differed from those of women. There are, again, based on historical patterns, perhaps more men in certain fields where they might carry the title doctor. There are all these kinds of proxies for gender, which served in Apple's model to generate those predictions and recommendations for men over women. By not including just the simple field, man or woman, Apple wasn't able to see that their model was having this kind of biased impact in its recommendations. And so when we consult on these things, oftentimes recommend leaving these sensitive variables even in certain cases, so that you can see the kind of bias that might be being perpetuated by the model that you're building. So again, we call that fairness through awareness. So being aware of the ways that your model may or may not be fair for the people that it's impacting.
So there are a couple of questions in here about legality. So how do I know if I'm not causing any harm or illegal effect? And then another, legally speaking, who is responsible for AI harm? Want to throw out a disclaimer, we are not lawyers. But we do work very closely with them, and that is something that we do have regular conversations about. And so it's really important to understand what are the legal requirements in the region that you are working or building. And it can be pretty confusing, particularly in the US. We have a number of different cities and states in the US that are creating their own legal regulations. In the state of Illinois, there are regulations about using AI in hiring decisions. In the state of Washington, there is a bill being debated right now that would restrict governments from procuring or using an AI system that is not fair for protected users, protected community groups like by gender or age. Later this spring, the EU is going to release their draft AI regulations. So anybody that is building AI in the EU or will have customers using the AI that are located in the EU will have to comply with these regulations. So we are waiting to see exactly what those regulations are. But you really do need to have somebody on staff that is a lawyer and is familiar with all of the relevant regulations to ensure that you are in compliance, because what is ethical and what is legal, there's oftentimes a lot of overlap between them, but they are not one and the same. What can be ethical may be illegal, and what may be legal may be unethical. And so you need to have both points of view.
Yeah, I think there's a question here that I think is really interesting, actually, which is, based on the cultural point of view of the average Mexican or Latin American, for that matter, what would you consider to be the best approach to introduce AI into our society? And because I don't feel equipped to answer that exact question, I'm going to reinterpret the question a little bit, which is, what should AI do? Right? What jobs are best suited for AI? And what are the positive applications, right? We've spent a lot of time talking and thinking about all of the potential bad things that AI can do. And so what are some of the amazing, powerful, world-changing things that AI can do? And where should it be introduced and integrated into society? So I'll start, and then Kathy, I'm sure you have lots of additional thoughts. So the first most basic level is that AI can and possibly should be introduced for jobs that are rote and routine, require very little skill or judgment, human judgment, if you will, that are dangerous, that are dirty, that are drudgery, right? Things like that. So for example, if you're just making calculations of risk scores, right? If you don't need a person to go in and enter into a calculator 80 billion times a day, those calculations. AI can and should do those jobs because it can free up people to do higher skilled, more valuable jobs. AI can and should be introduced in places that would be dangerous for people to work. So for example, there are drones that are equipped with artificial intelligence vision that can fly over farm fields and crops or refugee camps or power lines and do scanning of population movements, of climate change, of safety and security, et cetera, which are in places that would be nearly impossible for people to reach. And AI can power incredible reach by virtue of doing that in a way that people couldn't. And so it's augmenting human capabilities and capacities in addition to what a human could do on their own, right? And so we see that there are incredible positive applications. I'll just give one more example and then let Kathy talk, which is also obviously in medicine, right? Where we've seen real advancements in artificial intelligence in its ability to diagnose certain types of cancer or disease. So, over the course of a career, a radiologist who looks at X-rays to identify cancer tumors may see thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even 100,000 X-rays if they were really good and looking at a lot of X-rays. And so they will, over time, get pretty good at identifying what a cancer tumor looks like. But an artificial intelligence system can look at millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions of those images and learn that much at that much greater scale to identify what a cancer tumor looks like, assuming it's been fed the information of this is a cancer tumor, this is not, this is a cancer tumor, this is not, over and over and over again. And so it becomes incredibly accurate and able to identify, even in some cases better than people, those cancer tumors. And so there are applications early on and great jobs that AI can do in society that are powerful, empowering, inclusive, and while we still need to be protecting from the harmful potential impacts that we've discussed, they really can accelerate development and society as it grows, changes, increases quality of life for people, et cetera. Sorry, that was a long answer, Kathy. I don't know if you have anything that you want to add there.
I think that's fantastic. I think one of the things that I would recommend is the importance of understanding the role every single individual in society has to ensure that technology, whether it's AI or otherwise, is inclusive and respectful of everyone. Always asking that question of not just can we do it, but should we do it? What is fair? Is everyone being treated fairly? And so it's been years that we've had researchers like Joy Belawame and Timnit Gebru that have raised alarm bells about the racial and gender disparities and inaccuracies in facial recognition technology. But it wasn't until last year with the resurgence of Black Lives Matter that really there was more conversation about how facial recognition technology and predictive policing technology are being used against communities of color and the huge disparities that are resulting. So seeing over and over and over again, innocent Black men being arrested because facial recognition erroneously identified them as the person who committed the crime, when a human being can take a look at the picture of an individual and the image in the surveillance camera and say, that's not the same individual. And so we really have to ask these questions of, is this technology fair? Is this something that is being applied equitably across all of society? And if it's not, then we need to demand change. When it comes to the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation, we saw how devastating that was in the US and the hit to our democracy. And so as a society, again, we really have to demand that technology be responsible, that we think about what is the impact it's having on our government systems, on the fabric of our society, on human health. And if we don't like the answer that we are seeing, then we can, as consumers, not use those products, not give our business, our time, our attention to those products. As employees, decide not to give our brain and talent and go and work at those companies. We can vote for the individuals that are going to be the regulators, to ensure that we vote in the individuals that are going to put in regulations that protect society. So every single one of us has responsibility to think about and become aware of the technology that's being created, how it's being used in our society, and demand that it be done in a way that protects human rights first and foremost.
So I know we're over time, and I don't actually think we have very many more questions. So I think we will stop there. And Fabi, do you want to close for everyone?
Yes, but first, thank you very much, Kathy and Joab. I think this was an amazing talk. I think all the questions were very, very, very interesting, and all your answers, all the presentation, thank you. Really, really, really great talk you have here. And so I'm going to switch again to Spanish just to say goodbye to all our participants and assistants. But thank you very much. Gracias a todos nuestros asistentes. Les recuerdo que la charla va a estar grabada en nuestra fanpage de @zonaeigdl y que esta es una de las 3 charlas que tendremos con el equipo de Salesforce. Los esperamos en la siguiente edición, que sería el próximo 30 de marzo a las 7 en punto. Y por otro lado, también les queremos invitar esta misma semana, el jueves 25 a las 10 a.m., tendremos una charla con el BitLab y con Paco Solsona de Google. Será este jueves, están invitados también. Cuídense mucho y gracias por esta sesión y esta noche. Hasta luego.